Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you. Is the relationship between art and technology? Well, I guess it depends on how you define art and technology, doesn't it? You knew I was going to do that, didn't you? My family sometimes listens to this podcast, and I can just see my sister Hannah rolling her eyes like, come on, really? But if we define technology the way I do, is how animals rearrange the physical world to achieve their ends, including by making tools, then clearly technology has been involved in art from the beginning. We might even say art is technology if we really wanted to push it. It involves brushes and paints and chisels and musical instruments and we could go on like that forever. And we can also look at key moments when technological developments have led to revolutions in art, whether that's the introduction of the piano and classical music or the creation of photography or film later on. By the 20th century, thinkers like Louis Mumford and Walter Benjamin were reflecting in a serious way on how technological change was affecting the nature of art. But in the post-World War II period, visual artists started working with engineers, scientists, and technologists in whole new ways. And that's the story of Patrick McCray's recent book, Making Art Work: How Cold War Engineers and Artists Forged a New Creative Culture. In our conversation, Patrick and I talk about how this new alliance between artists and technical folks came to be and what it meant for the art and business worlds of the time. We also talk about how this longer history connects to our moment through institutions such as MIT's famed and controversial Media Lab. And finally, we talk about how this history leads to the so-called STEAM education of today. That's science, technology, engineering, art, and math. A movement that so often feels like a corporate top-down initiative born of the money-grubbing fever dreams of higher education administrators. I hope you enjoy this conversation. We had a lot of fun. Get excited. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Lee. Glad to be here.
Making Artwork is a neat book, and we'll talk about how it kind of works in a space that's been underexplored by folks with us. But just to start off with, when you tell strangers, in these weird COVID times, maybe you don't talk to too many strangers about your book. But if you were to tell strangers about your book, what would you tell them it's about and what you were trying to do with it?
Yeah, so I guess the easiest thing to say is the book is about the ways in which artists and engineers in the last 50 years have collaborated together and have come together, like the title says, to make artwork. I guess sort of the key takeaway point is that at least in pre-pandemic times, we were sort of witnessing another wave of these kind of artist-engineer collaborations. Whether or not that will continue or what that will look like in the years and months to come remains to be seen. But that was sort of the, point of it all.
Yeah, so you've written books about giant telescopes, moon watchers, technologists who put forward grandiose visions of space colonies and nanotechnologies. So what led you to turn to art and technology? Was it really seeing like these more recent collaborations that you mentioned and then wondering about its background, or what got you into it?
I think there were probably three things. So first of all, as I sort of look at what I've done with my life in the last 20 years in terms of work, one of the themes has consistently been an interest in technological communities, communities of people that come together around specific technologies and specific projects. And, we can say more about that if you want.
Yeah.
A second part also was, going all the way back to when I was a graduate student. I've had a long interest in art and museums and things like that. So this, in some ways, was a bit of a return or a looping back to research topics I've been interested in, going back to the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, one of the guiding principles in book projects that I do is I try to pick something that I don't really know much about. And I use the writing of the book as a sort of a path of self-education, if you will, to try to get to learn about a new topic. And when I started this project on making artwork, when did I start that? 2012-ish. I didn't really know much about art. I had a pretty naive understanding of what art and the art world was like and what artists did. And this, in many ways, was a chance to educate myself about a topic that I've been interested in, but didn't really know much about.
Yeah, that's cool, man. I mean, I think you point out in the intro that, rightly, that historians of science and technology, I mean, there's exceptions to what I'm about to say, but historians of science and technology have tended not to look at this art technology juncture very much. It's kind of an underexplored area. And do you have a sense of why that is? I mean, after doing all this work, why do you think it's so underexplored?
I think a couple reasons. Clearly there is a small body of work that's been developed for several years that has looked at this, and some of that's quite good. And I reference a lot of that in the work. I think part of it is if you sort of think about the histories of science and technology or STS in general, we tend to import ideas into our fields rather than export the ideas. And I think that's especially true in the history of science and technology, maybe a little bit less so in STS stuff. So, as I was working on this, I was sort of interested in what were some ideas from the history of science and technology that might be of some interest or utility to art historians. I can't say that I did that with a whole lot of success, but that was sort of one of the things that I was interested in. We talk a lot about laboratories and research and experiments, and we know an awful lot about that. And these are ideas that art historians use as well, but in different capacities. And I was interested in seeing ways in which those things linked up. I think another problem also, and it's kind of a classic long-standing problem in our fields, is sort of this confusion and conflation about science and technology. And, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But, as you look at sort of the historical sources about art and science and technology, that confusion about what is engineering, what is technology, what is science, those confusions and conflations, are all the way back there in the 1960s.
Yeah, they get worse as you dig down, not clearer or something like that.
Yeah, and I think there's a fundamental distinction between art and science and art and technology. And there's a very real reason why I focused on engineers and technology in the book rather than places where art and science kind of connect around issues of beauty and symmetry and whatever. I wasn't really interested in that,
right?
Because fundamentally artists are like engineers in that they design stuff, they make stuff, they work with their hands. Art, like engineering, is a very future-looking sort of activity. I mean, when you set out to make something, whether it's a painting or a multimedia thing or whatever, you're imagining what it's going to be like in the future in the same way as like someone, building a bridge or designing a circuit or whatever. So I think for those reasons, the art technology nexus, at least for me, makes more sense.
You mentioned in passing this notion of community, which I think has been kind of a guiding concept in a lot of your work, as you said. And I would say that, a bit pulled out a bit. I think it's also, there was other folks who you're connected with in kind of your generation or so who are also been playing with it. I think of like our late friend Dan Johnson and Cyrus Modi and other folks who've often used this idea. So what do you find useful about the notion of community, or maybe more like analytic of community?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I've certainly had lots of conversations with Anne and Cyrus about this. And I think it was kind of one of those things where I was using it as an analytical tool without really recognizing it as such. And I think, it was talking to people like that who kind of you write about communities, like, oh yeah, I guess I do. I never
Hmm.
really thought about it. But I think the thing that at least that works for me is it's a analytical term or a unit of analysis that has a lot of plasticity to it. It's not as rigidly defined as like a discipline, or it's certainly larger than a laboratory group or a academic department.
Mm.
It's nowhere near as sprawling, however, as like a professional society or whatever. And communities come together around instruments and projects and
Hmm.
um, specific maybe technological goals, if you will, and they form and they coalesce, and maybe they remain together and develop into something that's a little more codified, or maybe they dissolve and dissipate over time.
Hmm.
And it's sort of that quasi ephemerality of the community that I like a lot. And
Hmm.
also, it kind of opens itself up. I mean, community sounds more friendly than discipline.
Yeah, yeah.
And it sort of allows for students and journalists and popular writers to also kind of be part of that community. And in the book Making Artwork, that was certainly part of the story. I mean, you have your artists and engineers, but you've also got curators, and you have journalists who are writing about this confluence of art and technology, and all of them together constitute this community of people, which, at least in this first wave that I write about in the book, existed for about a decade or so and then faded
Yeah.
away.
Hmm. Um, you in the introduction, you describe older movements around art and technology, or that described them like futurism and things that go back to the earlier 20th century. But as your title says, your story is really one about the Cold War and this period of collaboration between engineers and artists. So why'd you choose to focus on that period, and what do you think has made it different than the things that came before?
Yeah, so the three sort of earlier 20th century movements that I referenced would be the Italian Futurists, the Bauhaus in Germany, and the Russian Constructivists. And I think the thing that makes this Cold War coming together of artists and engineers different is a couple of things. I mean, first of all, there was a lot of media spectacle attached to it. So in some ways, it kind of parallels a lot of the big science projects that we know about of the 50s and 60s and onward. Sort of being a vulgar materialist, I'm always very interested in who pays for this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and the funding structure for supporting artists and engineers in this period of time in the 60s, early 70s was changing. There were a lot of
Hmm.
top shelf corporations that were putting a lot of money into it, or at the very least, allowing their engineers to partner with artists. And the parallels between the art community and the engineering community in the 1960s are very striking. And maybe we can say something about that later on. But it was kind of that coming together of like scale and funding and media attention that was really different from, say, what you would have with regard to those earlier movements of the
Hmm.
early 20th century that I referenced. And I think also, you had the Italian futurists who were very much, enamored with technology and the
Yeah.
violence and the spectacle of it. But, they wrote manifestos and they made
Yeah.
artwork. They didn't really bring engineers together to collaborate in any sort of meaningful way. Whereas that very much was the focus of the communities and the activities that I ended up writing about.
Hmm. Your story launches, and I just realized that's an unintentional and terrible pun, with
Nicely.
the story of American-born rocket engineer Frank Molina. So, who was Molina, and why'd you find him a kind of useful road to get into the story you wanted to tell?
Yeah, so I mean, I knew about Molina, of course, because of earlier interest and stuff I'd written about space exploration and stuff like that. And Molina's a really fascinating character in the sense that he's um, he's born in the United States. His family's Czechoslovakian. He grows up in rural Texas, and he finally makes his way to Pasadena in the 1930s for graduate school at Caltech. And he has as his mentor the great aeronautical engineer Theodore von Karman. And when he's at Caltech, he gets very much caught up in this idea of the science and engineering of rocketry, which in the 1930s would have been considered a very poor career move. The Depression was on. It would have been made much more sense for him just to get his degree from Caltech and go work in the aviation industry. But he gets involved with rocketry, but he also gets involved with socialism and arguably a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s, which in the 1930s wasn't that crazy or radical of an idea. But in the 1950s, when it comes back to bite him, it is seen in a much different sort of way.
Yeah.
During World War II, he is very much involved with a rocketry program at Caltech to help build weapons for the U.S. military. After the Second World War ends, he visits the Trinity site in New Mexico, so he sees firsthand, what sort of destruction happens, with nuclear weapons. And then during the war, he's also based in London, so he also sees the effect of German rockets on the civilian population in British cities. And, he understands eventually that rockets will become better and more powerful and able to fly longer distances. And then eventually they will be mated with nuclear weapons. And he sees that future and he doesn't want any part of it. So he joins UNESCO, which is based in Paris after the Second World War, and really wants to find ways to apply science to the betterment of global society. UNESCO is arguably a fairly left-wing sort of organization, so its relationship with the United States was always dicey. By this point, Molina is under pretty heavy FBI surveillance because of his, first of all, because of his rocketry knowledge, and second of all, because of his communist past. And eventually, in the early 50s, his passport is not renewed, and he's basically marooned in Paris around the same time that he decides to quit his job at UNESCO and become a professional artist. The part, I guess, that I found just, the lovely ironic twist was during the Second World War, he helped start a company, which is still very active today, called Aerojet. And Aerojet today makes solid rocket boosters, which go into all sorts of missiles and rockets and stuff like that. But Molina holds on to his Aerojet stock, which after Second World War, goes skyward. And all of a sudden he finds himself really wealthy as a result of helping start a company, which is helping make rocket engines to eventually build ICBMs. So there's all sorts of just crazy, ironies and contradictions and stuff there. But the end result is he is able to afford to quit his job and become a professional artist, but he's marooned in Paris for several years because of his issues with his passport and the fact that the State Department won't reissue it. So he's really stuck there to become an artist.
And you see, one of the reasons you focus on him is because he's kind of bringing in engineering knowledge to his artwork, right? So, I should tell listeners that there are some wonderful images in the book that they should check out. And maybe we should say we should probably talk about a piece of his or two that people can check out online if they're interested in it, in learning more. But why don't you say a bit about how he brings engineering knowledge to kind of bear in pieces?
Yeah, he does it in two ways. One of them is he really, he makes this statement that, in Paris, when he's becoming a self-taught professional artist, he's going around to all the galleries and he gets sick of seeing all of the still lifes and all the kinds of, as he says, dead fish, flowers, and nudes. He's just sick of seeing the standard stuff that's sort of the French painters of that era were doing. So he really is wondering, why aren't people painting and capturing images from science and engineering and things like that? So a lot of his artworks are science themed or engineering themed. So there's that part of it. But he's also very much into experimentation, and he wants to do something new as an artist. Which I think sort of reflects his engineering background. I mean, pardon the expression, he wants to become an innovator. He doesn't want to just make paintings, but he wants to experiment and find new ways of making artwork. So, he experiments with wire mesh and putting lights behind wire mesh and whatever. And he finally latches on to this sort of combination of, sort of electrokinetic painting. So, sort of imagine, he has these small electric motors that he attaches to plastic discs that are painted, that rotate, that have lights behind them, that kind of create this, very peaceful, contemplative sense of like light and color. But it's electrified. I mean, these are electric motors with
Hmm.
lights and then traditional painting. So, these are artworks that he begins to make, first of all, at a fairly small scale. But by the time he's kind of wrapping up his career as a painter in the mid 1960s, he's making works that are like 6 feet by 10 feet in size and weigh several hundred pounds and,
Hmm.
cost a fair amount of money to make. So, those are kind of like two ways that his engineering background really comes to play, I think.
In one of your discussions of Molina, you talk about a conversation you were having with someone from the art world. I think it was a museum world.
Yeah.
And this person asked you if Molina was an important artist. And I thought this was just a wonderful kind of conversation about like different scholarly communities, because you say there what this person meant after you talked to more people of this sort. Was he any good? So I just thought, I mean, like, how do you see I don't know, how did you understand things differently as a kind of historian approaching these things than maybe like someone from the art world looking at these works
Yeah,
too?
I mean, this was a good part of my, the education process that I went through in doing this project was understanding that the ways in which our community evaluates things and the way the art history community thinks about things are really quite different. Yeah, this conversation was, with someone at a museum in Washington D.C., and we were just, I was talking about Molina's art, and they had never heard of him, and that was the question they asked was, was he any good? And I think they were a little bit surprised, like, first of all, like, well, he was a professional artist in the sense that, he made artworks and he sold them. I mean, and he exhibited them in galleries, including
Hmm.
some major shows in New York City and Washington, D.C., and certainly lots of shows in Europe. He had solo shows. He was included in some really, high profile um, art art shows in the 50s and 60s. But the whole thing, I guess, for me was kind of interesting. Is you wouldn't really, if you were talking to a historian of science and you say, "Oh, I'm writing a history of Lee Vinsel, the scientist from the 19th century," and they'd be like, "Oh, was he an important scientist? Like, did he do anything important?" Like, that really wouldn't be like the first question we would go to.
Yeah.
We would just say, like, well, this person was a scientist, and like that would be it, full stop. And this kind of led me, and this is something I was really clear about in the introduction, was that I have no interest in adjudicating whether these works of art that these people made are good or not. That's not
Yeah.
really the point, in the
Yeah.
sense that I wouldn't, as a historian of science, say like, well, this was a good experiment or a bad experiment in
Yeah.
terms of judging it. I mean, we might evaluate it on different criteria, but that would not be like our go-to place to think about. So I just kind of worked with the sense of these were professional artists who were making artworks that were exhibited and displayed and written about in professional art magazines. And if people want to evaluate them in terms of their value in the art world or their aesthetic value or whatever, that's fine. But that wasn't really something I was interested in doing, nor is it something like intellectually or professionally I'm equipped to do. I mean, I'm not someone who's a specialist in aesthetics or whatever. I mean, I know
Yeah.
what I like, and I think I have some sense of good art versus bad art, maybe, but that's not my day job.
Yeah. In a book like this, I think it would be odd if C.P. Snow's idea of like the two cultures didn't come up. But I really liked your treatment. And I felt like it. This is the first time in a long time I read something about it, and it felt kind of fresh and new and worth reading. So thank you for doing that. But I was wondering if you could just for listeners who might not know about this idea, whether you could just kind of introduce this notion and talk about how you saw it playing out in the story you were
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to the story in a couple of ways. Like you say, it would be almost impossible to write this book without referencing it in some way. And I wanted to do something a little bit different with it compared to how it's usually brought up. So C.P. Snow is this British chemist who eventually becomes a novelist and becomes sort of a statesman or technocrat of British post-war science policy, and eventually becomes Lord Snow and Sir. He gets his peerage and all that kind of stuff. But his main thing is in 1959 he gives a speech in Cambridge, about the two cultures, which he basically describes as this divide between literary intellectuals or literary humanists and the scientific community. And it's basically, it's largely a critique, if you will, of like the British class system at the time, and also his sense that the people who were running Britain's foreign policy, et cetera, were not really like au courant with what was actually happening in like the science and the world of science and engineering. And he felt that this was like a real problem, like potentially a threat to British national security. The crazy thing is, and this is something I was a little bit surprised that nobody had really picked up on before, is that as you actually read The Two Cultures, which maybe not everyone actually does, you find that later on in the book, he's actually critical of both these literary intellectuals and scientists for being ignorant of technology. And if anything, he is critical of both of those communities for sort of denigrating the world of applied science and engineering.
Yeah.
So, a deeper reading of C.P. Snow has him being very much in favor of, what we would call applied science or engineering or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the book is, the lecture becomes a book. The book becomes a huge sensation. It's a bestseller. It appears on syllabi of, college campuses all throughout the Western world. But as the idea of the two cultures migrates from Great Britain to the United States, it takes on a different cast because it's no longer caught up in this world of like British class differences and people educated at Oxbridge versus the red brick universities and all the other sort of stuff. And it becomes a very convenient tool in the United States for people who are trying to reform, say, for example, engineering education. They could point to this problem of the two cultures and how do we bring the arts and humanities into engineering so you're producing more well-rounded engineering students. So it kind of becomes this shorthand, if you will, all throughout the 1960s, where you could just say, and I'm going to put the scare quotes up here for people who can't see, the two cultures, and people would sort of know what you were talking about without having to like go through this long explication that I just went through. But it becomes like a very valuable rhetorical tool, both for artists who want to work with engineers and corporate managers who are trying to broker these partnerships, and university administrators. I mean, you start to see, no surprise, popping up in like commencement addresses and stuff like that. It just becomes like this very like handy phrase that, summarizes and diagnoses all of these like ills with the American university system without having to like really unpack it.
Mm-hmm. Another artist that you talk about is Billy Kluver. So I was hoping you could say a bit about him, but also I was hoping you could say a bit about his position at Bell Labs and how this kind of brings in a different dynamic than we've talked about with Molina so far.
Yeah, so one of the other main characters in the book is an electrical engineer named Billy Kluver. He was born in Sweden, and he grew up there as a teenager during the Second World War, and during the war, and then shortly after, he becomes really enamored with like Swedish avant-garde film and what have you. At the same time that he's a physics undergrad student at university in Stockholm. And, he is kind of like a classic embodiment of someone who is, really into science and engineering, but is also really caught up in modern art and experimental film. He leaves Sweden, I think, in 1954. He goes to UC Berkeley to get his PhD in electrical engineering, which he does. And I think he graduates in 1958. And, but he continues his interest in modernist fiction and art and film and all that while he's a student at Berkeley. He audits philosophy classes and stuff like that. But then after he graduates in 58, because he's a electrical engineer with a PhD from an elite school, and this was a period of time where electrical engineers and engineers in general could pretty much write their own ticket if they were competent. he has a whole choice of jobs open up to him. I mean, he's offered a position at the Stanford Research Institute. He's offered a job at RCA, but eventually he accepts a position at Bell Laboratories, which in the late 1950s was arguably the world's best corporate research and development laboratory. I mean, it's a little bit like, graduating from the minor leagues and getting like recruited and getting a job with the New York Yankees at the time. I mean, this was like the place to be. So Kluver ends up in New Jersey, and his specialty is laser physics. So he has his whole physics research, electrical engineering research program at Bell Labs. He is working in an environment that is extremely supportive and paternalistic in the best possible sense of basically just allowing researchers to do what they want. And, as long as there's some sort of, corporate tie-in, to the Bell Labs mission. Kluver remains interested in avant-garde art, and where he's living in northern New Jersey, of course, he's working his day job at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, but he's spending his nights and his weekends in Manhattan and Greenwich Village and whatever, hanging out with artists and actually helping curate some art shows, hanging out with artists in their lofts and studios and galleries and all that sort of stuff. So, he really becomes this important person who works to formally bring together these communities of artists and engineers, starting, as early as the early 1960s.
So just like you just said, that he's kind of this interesting network connector between these kind of two worlds. And I was hoping we could talk a bit about each of those worlds. So, what for, the leaders at companies like Bell Labs and other kind of corporations that get involved in this stuff, what is attractive to them about this? Like, why would they get involved in these kinds of initiatives?
I think there are a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it was, they were flush with money. I mean, they could afford to do it. This was a time of great American prosperity, even great Western prosperity, which, arguably helped foster some of these art and technology collaborations overseas as well. So you have companies like Bell Telephone, just making money hand over fist, companies like IBM, all of the various aerospace and defense and avionics companies, they can afford to do this sort of stuff, coupled with the fact that I don't want to say there was a shortage of engineers, but there definitely was a competitive aspect to recruiting engineers and keeping them on your workforce and keeping them happy. And, the IBM would do this by basically, creating a, country club essentially for its engineers to golf and spend their weekends or whatever. I mean, there were these attempts by companies to make it as comfortable as possible for their employees so they wouldn't pull up stakes and go somewhere else. And then you'd have to like retrain somebody all over again. And Bell Labs certainly fit that category. So this was in some ways part of, keeping your engineers happy, allowing them to do what they want to do. But I think there was also a sense that, you never really got there was a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but maybe a lot of like unknown about like what led to successful commercial innovation, what led to creativity. And I think of this idea that if you allow engineers to play in the sandbox with artists, they may pick up ideas that they could then bring back to their day job and might, provide the seeds for some new commercial product, or maybe would just help stir their creativity in ways that would be beneficial to the company's bottom line. So, I think there were a number of reasons why corporate managers did that. And also, I mean, it looked good. I mean, if you're a company whose job is, whose commercial product is missiles, well, maybe having like some art projects is kind of a way of, art washing some of the stuff that, that your corporation is doing.
Yeah. And it also, I mean, maybe they liked having access to these social worlds. I mean, I remember you saying one of the people you talked to was saying like, well, they had access to, girlfriends basically, right? Or there were pretty girls in the art world.
Yeah.
Was
right.
I mean, very sexist way of putting it, but still.
It sounds sexist to us today, but I think that reflected the social reality of the 1960s was that the world of the engineer in the 1960s was a very white, masculine world. And most engineers didn't work with women. I mean, they had them around, as administrative assistants and lab technicians and what have you. But, it was a very masculine sort of world. And this idea of partnering with artists definitely opened up social networks that these engineers otherwise probably wouldn't have had such easy access to.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like they were just doing it in the hope of meeting potential girlfriends, but I think that, at least according to some of the people I spoke to, was not not a bad side benefit, if you will,
right.
of this. And some long-term relationships did come out of this. Some people did get married, and so that happened.
On the flip side, the artists who end up getting involved with these guys are not. I mean, they're not nobodies, right? I mean, it include Robert Rauschenberg and John Cage and a number of other big names. So how did Kluver and his gang form those connections? Was that just a natural part of them being, hanging out in Manhattan, or, what's the story there?
I think partly for Kluver, at least, it's, kind of what I call the Swedish connection. So when he's in Stockholm, it's a fairly small community, and the people that he meets, even as he's a teenager or a college student, he meets Pontus Hultén, who becomes a director of the Modern Art Museum in Stockholm. He meets some Swedish artists, like Klaus Oldenburg and Oyvind Fahlström, who go on to become, big names in the 60s and 70s, art world. So he's able to sort of play on those Swedish connections. And, it's in part through those links. He's also at Bell Laboratories, which is an elite organization.
Yeah.
So that helps a little bit. And, very quickly, he begins to have these one-on-one partnerships with people like Rauschenberg and John Cage and Yvonne Rainer and Andy Warhol. And then what he decides to do is he wants to expand on this. So it's not just these one-on-one sorts of things, but he wants to scale it up so it becomes more of a networking thing that would bring, have hundreds of artists on tap to partner them with hundreds of engineers to sort of create a much larger sort of endeavor. And that, of course, becomes the basis of the organization that he co-founds in 1966 called Experiments in Art and Technology. But it really starts from these one-on-one interactions of working with people like Rauschenberg, who he was very close to, and working with them to help them realize whatever particular aesthetic vision that they had, but also contributing to that vision. Again, not just being a person with a screwdriver, who knows how to wire something, but actually contributing to it in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask you about Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT. I mean, I think this group's very famous in some circles of people who care about this history. Probably less well known to the general public. But how did you understand, like, in the overarching story that you're telling, like, what is the significance of EAT? Is it about a kind of formalization of these communities, or how do you see that?
Okay, so first of all, it's always EAT. They never go with EAT.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, there you go. I'm showing my ignorance.
No, I mean, it's natural. It's always EAT. So EAT, was co-founded in the fall of '66 with Billy Kluver and his co-fellow engineer at Bell Labs, Fred Waldhauer. But they co-founded with Robert Rauschenberg and Bob Whitman, who were two avant-garde artists at the time. And basically, EAT was this New York-based nonprofit, the goal of which was to bring artists and engineers together. So sort of serve as like a matchmaking service, if you will, but also to provide seminars and information to artists who might want to experiment with, electrical circuits and microprocessors and computers and lasers and all sorts of other sorts of media that to us today don't seem that sophisticated, but to in the mid 1960s would have been very daunting for an artist to have access to or to figure out how to use. And Kluver and company see EAT as this sort of brokerage or brokering service, if you will, to connect up these two different communities. And it was pretty successful at doing that. It lasted for about 5 or 6 years, and then it kind of fades away for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. But, at its heyday, it probably had about 3,000 or 4,000 members. It was based in New York City, but there were some local chapters, especially in Los Angeles. Had a very active local chapter as well. So, in that sense, it was pretty successful. And Kluver was really clear about it in the sense that, he stated several times that he didn't expect EAT to stay around forever. He's like, it was basically to be a temporary organization to foster this dialogue between artists and engineers. And eventually that mission would get taken up by companies and universities and whatever. This was sort of a stopgap or a seed, if you will, around which these other collaborative partnerships might eventually form, is what he was hoping for.
Yeah. I see the formation in the book. I see the formation of EAT as like one beat, and there's a couple other that I want to look at with you. So in '68, Molina again comes back in, and he co-founds. He helps create this journal Leonardo, which he then edits until his death in 1981. So kind of like EAT. I mean, how do you see, what is the significance of Leonardo, a journal that continues to this day?
So in 1968, Molina founds this journal Leonardo, and it's supposed to be a journal, and it's still published today. I mean, it's still published by MIT Press.
Right.
So it just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Molina was frustrated with a couple things. So first of all, he, in his own experiments with electricity and light and making these sort of electrokinetic paintings, he realizes that there were other artists who had done similar things before him, but there was no way of documenting this, which, to a research engineer, this was anathema. I mean, there should be like some sort of like credit and like, priority for discovery and whatever. When he finds out that other people have done this, he's a little appalled and a little, I think, concerned that maybe he is like, I don't want to say plagiarizing, but like copying what other artists have done, because there's no like way of establishing priority. And second of all, he's really, so first of all, let's be clear, Molina really does not like art critics. I mean, he's very hostile to the jargon-laden, to people who write about art, but who aren't making the art. Yeah. He doesn't understand like why artists aren't using their own voices to write about their own experiments, why they're relying on the mouthpiece of the critic to say, like, to use you as an example, Lee, well, Lee made this artwork, but Lee's not going to describe it. He's going to depend or wait until an art critic interprets it for the public. Yeah. And he's like, no scientist ever does that. A scientist does an experiment and they write up the results of the experiment themselves and they publish it. And that's how they communicate their knowledge and what they're doing. But it's also how they get like credit and priority for whatever discovery that they've made. So he sees Leonardo as basically a journal for artists that's modeled on scientific journals, is kind of originally how he's imagining it. And unlike other art journals at the time, it has no advertisements. So there are no advertisements for galleries or shows or whatever, because he sort of saw that as like a corrupting influence of, if you're an artist, your gallery promotes you as an artist. And, again, coming from the world of a scientist or an engineer, that just kind of rubbed him the wrong way. I mean, he basically is sort of hostile to what we can call like the museum gallery industrial complex, if you will. So Leonardo, it starts in '68, like all journals, it, slowly acquires, a circulation and a readership and what have you. But it's very much a way for Molina to bring these worlds of the artist, the scientist, and the engineer together without sort of the critic as a mediating sort of person, if you will. And again, I think it's clear, some of the articles in the early issues of Leonardo are interesting. Some appear as filler because as an editor, he was trying to like get articles in there. But, in that 5 decades since the journal has been published, it has kind of become like one of the central journals, if you will, for people who are writing about this nexus, if you will, of art and science and technology. And like you say, Molina is the editor-in-chief of the journal until '81 when he passes away in Paris. And it's also important, I guess, to point out that the journal is based in Paris. And of course, by this point, the center of the art world is no longer Paris. It had migrated long ago to New York City. But Molina is still based there. And as a result, the journal is exceptionally international. So it's
Huh.
not just a,
Yeah.
it's published initially by a British press. It's not solely for the American community. Most of the authors are European. He includes many Asian artists. He's very keen to get artists and other writers from behind the Iron Curtain involved. So he really imagines it as like a scientific journal, something that would be exceptionally international and broad looking in its focus.
Hmm. So the third beat I wanted to cover with you is the Pepsi Pavilion at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, which is another kind of, for some worlds, very famous thing. And I encourage listeners to check it out online because there's pretty good photos of it there. So, and importantly, I think, not only is this kind of a moment, a famous moment in the story of art and technology, but it also involves EAT. So why don't you talk a bit about, how it came to be, what it is, how it came to be, and, what significance you think it has for the history?
Sure. So Expo 70 was in Osaka, Japan in 1970. It was the first World's Fair held in an Asian country. And for the Japanese coming after World War II, this was an exceptionally important thing for them. This was a chance to showcase the progress Japan had made, both socially and economically and technologically. This was to sort of be Japan's sort of international coming out moment, if you will. Pepsi was one of the few American companies that was given its own particular or own specific pavilion at the expo. Like many World's Fairs, there were lots of national pavilions. So the United States had a pavilion, the Soviet Union had one, and so forth. But there were not many American companies that had their own pavilions, and Pepsi was one of them. Pepsi also had the soft drink concessions for the expo. And Pepsi at this time, was the world's second biggest soft drink purveyor, compared to that other company that makes sugared water.
Yes.
And Pepsi wanted to, enlarge its customer base in the Asian markets. So in 1968, Pepsi executives are looking for a novel approach for their pavilion. They talked to a number of different collectives, if you will, of artists and technologists. But eventually they decided to partner with EAT. And for EAT, this, of course, is going to be a huge project. I mean, before they've been working on these sort of smaller scale artist-engineer collaborations, some small exhibitions and what have you. But this was really going to take it up a notch. The initial budget that Pepsi gives EAT is about $800,000, which in today's money, I can't do the conversion off the top of my head, but this is like several $1,000,000. So in some ways, and this is, I guess, why it was attractive to me, is the Pepsi Pavilion is sort of like the art world's version of big science. This is big art.
Yeah.
This is going to be lots of money, lots of media spectacle, lots of Cold War defense related technologies brought in the service of artwork. So, in some ways, it's kind of like the art world's version of a rocket launch, if you will.
Yeah.
EAT, works on this eventually. Literally scores of artists, engineers, technologists, architects, a whole assemblage of people are required to pull this off. It's also fair to say that it is above EAT's organizational capabilities. I mean, EAT at this point is a small organization with about 7 staff members. This is a huge project. I mean, this is just insanely large for them. And it's in another country.
Right.
And that is EAT's based in New York. They're basically or managing this project that is unfolding in Japan, which is many, many time zones away. So the archives of this project, which are at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, I mean, if you're podcast listeners, I'm making a visual of how many thousands of pages of documents there are of contracts and orders and telexes back and forth as they're trying to manage this thing, which is clearly beyond what they're capable of doing at this point. And the crazy thing is Pepsi, because they're rotating through vice presidents so rapidly at this point, no one at Pepsi is monitoring this. So the crazy thing is there's no actual formal contract
Yeah.
until like the project is almost over that like Pepsi like signs with EAT. And by this point, it's several $100,000 over budget,
One would
another
imagine.
parallel to big
Yes.
science projects. But it successfully opens in March of 1970. And, it's a fascinating thing. I would encourage listeners to look at images of it online, just, Pepsi Pavilion, Osaka, 1970. But,
Yeah.
from an art technology standpoint, it's pretty fascinating in terms of what EAT was able to do. But at the same time, the Pepsi executives that are paying for it just don't get it. I mean, they don't understand
Yeah.
why their logo isn't on display, or
Right.
like why they're not selling soft drinks or whatever. But I mean, EAT was really focused on basically like a choose your own adventure in the pavilion. So unlike the American pavilion where you sort of go through and you're kind of marched through all the different exhibits and then you just sort of emerge on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea with the Pepsi Pavilion was that you would go inside and just, experience it. Just see what you wanted to see, stay in there as long as you wanted to. If you wanted to stay in one room where there's like laser light displays, or if you wanted to be in the main room, which is this huge hemispherical mirror room that creates all sorts of interesting visual and auditory illusions. It really was a place for people to just have their own aesthetic experience,
Right.
which, EAT was really keen on promoting, but really had a hard time convincing the Pepsi executives, who very soon after it opens just basically shut it down and take it away from EAT and sort of install their own version of how they want it to be.
So this openness and, focus on individual experience and autonomy on the part of the viewer is very much a part of this moment of the like 60s, 70s vibe. But at the same time, during the 60s and 70s, this is a moment where the left and artists are intensely critical of corporations and that whole world. So, like, how often did that become a kind of tension in these art and technology worlds between kind of the people willing to play along with corporations and then maybe critics who are, I don't know, poking them or throwing things at them or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of, there's a wide range of opinion on that. And one of the major critiques that was leveled against some of these artist-engineer collaborations was that they were apolitical, that they were not coming out with a strong political statement about civil rights or Vietnam or what have you.
Yeah.
But that having been said, there certainly were artists who partner with engineers who did produce artworks that did make a political statement. So like Carolee Schneeman's piece in 1967, I think, called Snows, was very much an anti-Vietnam War piece. There were people like Hans Haacke and other artists who were connected with art and technology who also made works that very much had statements about corporate power, the military-industrial complex, and what have you. But at the same time, a lot of the artists were not uncomfortable with working with a large corporation, accepting their patronage or what have you. And one of the points, I think it's in one of the later chapters of the book, there's an art critic named Jack Burnham who puts on a show in 1970 at the Jewish Museum in New York called Software. And some of the artists that he brings into the show pull out once they realize that the major patron for the show is the American Motors Corporation. And they're like, whoa, no, we're not taking money from a car maker.
Yeah.
And Burnham's like, okay, but you'll take money from like the Guggenheim Foundation, which made its money through rapacious mining activities in the 19th century.
Right.
But that was like long ago. That doesn't bother you.
Yeah.
But you don't want to take money from a car maker because that's like right here in your face. But like the Guggenheim, that's okay.
Yep.
And this is an art critic and an art curator who's really chastising his artists for basically being hypocrites, if they will, about where they want to get their money from, and also like routinely complaining that they don't have enough money to start with.
Yeah.
He's like, well, there is money out there. You just need to be willing to work with these entities and take their support.
So your story goes in well, lots of different threads come out, goes in lots of different directions. And one of the places that it leads to is the creation of perhaps now infamous MIT Media Lab. And I wondered how you think about the Media Lab in this story, because on the one hand, it very much feels like a part of, this focus on art and technology is very much a part of its, organizational DNA. I'm putting that in quotation marks. On the other
Mhm.
hand, it becomes a kind of, their main, a lot of their main business is kind of like corporate services consulting, helping firms make gadgets and other kinds of things like that. So I just wonder how you think it fits in the story. Like, how is it different, and how is it, a part of this thing?
Yeah. Writing about the Media Lab, first of all, as a historian, was very difficult
Yep.
because it's an exceptionally poorly documented
Hmm.
organization relative to other organizations at MIT. I mean, I thought that there would actually be a collection of documents at MIT about the
Yeah.
Media Lab, that there would be like a collection I could mine, and there isn't.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not sure why that is. I've got my speculations a little bit. But unlike some of the other laboratories
Yeah.
and organizations that we know of at MIT, it has not done a very good job of preserving its own history.
Mm-hmm.
The history of the Media Lab, though, is pretty fascinating. I mean, what I was able to cobble together from a whole array of different archival sources was pretty fascinating. So, before the Media Lab at MIT, there was something called the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which still exists today. And it was started by a Hungarian born artist named Georgi Kepes. Kepes starts the Center for Advanced Visual Studies in 67. It's formally dedicated in 1968. And it never really finds a comfortable space within MIT. But Kepes's vision was that it would be a place for artists to interact with MIT scientists and engineers, and it would help educate MIT students about the visual arts. I mean, it would literally help MIT students bridge the two cultures, if you will,
Yeah.
by learning not just to appreciate visual arts, but by learning how to see, like how to train their eyes
Yep.
to see
Yep.
better.
Yep.
So Kepes has this whole thing. He retires. He's replaced by another artist named Otto Pina. But at the same time, one of the other people who's very active at MIT at this time is the architecture professor who later goes on to become the first director of the Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte. Negroponte and Kepes and Pina could not be further apart on the social spectrum. I mean, Negroponte's brother is deeply connected to the American national security establishment.
Hmm.
Negroponte comes from a wealthy Greek family. I mean, just again, Google a picture of him, and he is always dressed in a very dapper suit and tie kind of thing. And he wants to create this new center at MIT that would explore and experiment with computing technologies and new media technologies. And this becomes the Media Laboratory, which is finally dedicated in 1985 after Negroponte and Jerome Wiesner, a former MIT president, do a multi-year fundraising campaign. And they're exceptionally good at raising money from Japanese corporations like Sony and
Mm-hmm.
Hitachi, which at the time, like Bell Labs in the 60s, these companies in the early 80s are just flush with money.
Yep.
They want to be affiliated with MIT. They want to have a front row seat as to what new media technologies might be coming out of this. So they give millions of dollars, as do film studios in Southern California and what have you. The Media Lab is dedicated. It gets this brand new fancy building. But one of the crazy things, of course, being an academic, it's always fascinating to see the behind the scenes backstabbing that is going on, as Negroponte is very good at shivving his former colleagues at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies as he's getting the money to create this new building. And of course, as we all know, real estate is, the main thing that academic administrators care about.
Yeah.
So the fact that he's able to get this new building, designed by IMPay, this is a big deal. So there's the Media Lab of the early 1980s, which, Stuart Brand writes a best-selling book about. It's all about how the Media Lab is inventing the future and what have you. And as I write about in the book, it kind of reflects this second wave of art and technology that is very much less about artists and engineers and is more about like engineers and designers and the eventual commercialization of whatever is being produced at that particular nexus. Negroponte is very clear in his memos to the MIT administration that he's not interested in art. If something artistic, if something artistic gets done, that's great, but that's not his focus. I mean, he literally draws the distinction between himself and his colleagues and the clean, precise, orderly worlds in which they work versus this messy world of the artist that he really doesn't want to have any part of.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the media lab of the early, of the 21st century with Jeffrey Epstein and all that. But that's a different part of the story. But it's certainly something I had to be cognizant of in writing about it.
So I wanted to draw this line about commercialization forward a bit. I liked your conclusion a lot. It really is it kind of serves as an epilogue and kind of just touches on a bunch of themes you explore and draws it forward. And one of the threads you talk about is people who advocate that we should broaden STEM education, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, to STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And then you can add the humanities and make STEAM or whatever. I remember you attended some STEAM conference, and I think it was in Washington, D.C., and what I remember in particular is like wave after wave of kind of like snarky tweet coming out of you as you're kind of bludgeoned to death with jargon and like so many acronyms. And this is something you write about in the conclusion, is that it goes from being this kind of bottom up movement, very focused on artists, right, and art, to often a kind of top down corporate push led by business leaders and university administrators. So like what happened? Do you see that, like, as a historian, we're often very focused on contingency and how things could have gone other ways. But like, you can also look back into the 60s and see the kind of the very real kind of possibility of this history arising. So how do you see that transformation?
Yeah, I mean, so I think like for me, a key takeaway from the book is that this enthusiasm for art and technology, it's always there at a baseline level, but it certainly has these surges. And, I write about one of them in the 60s and 70s. I write about a second one that is sort of, that the Media Lab exemplifies in the 80s going up to the end of the dot-com boom. And then I write about this third one that, again, prior to COVID, I felt that we were in the middle of, which really began to kind of emerge around 2008, what have you. But this also happens at the same time that you have the Great Recession in 2008. And of course, the huge torpedo that the humanities seem to be taking amidships of like, what's going to happen as we all sort of were concerned about, the decline of humanities majors and the shutting down of departments at, less fortunate institutions and things like that. Yep. And then you kind of have this STEM to STEAM movement kind of bubbling up out of that at about the same time. And you sort of, at least as I saw it, and again, I have to be very careful here to sort of, there's me as a historian, but there's also me as a former engineer, but there's also me as a professor in a history department. So like, I'm never really sure like which hat I'm wearing, like, fully on my head. But, as someone who is a professor in a history department, I would sort of look at all this and be a little skeptical because I'm kind of like, well, I'm not really sure how this STEM to STEAM is like helping the humanities. It sort of feels like we're kind of being thrown this lifeline where we can kind of partner with the STEM fields and sort of demonstrate our relevance rather than like the 1960s version of art and technology where, both the artists and the engineers wanted to get something out of it. But at least for people like Billy Kluver, they saw the primary beneficiary as the art community. Yeah. Kluver was very clear. He's like, look, science and engineering is funded out the wazoo. Artists get nothing. And this is a way of helping artists get access to technology, resources, and patronage and things like that. So, when I see these like STEM to STEAM sorts of things, which by and large seem to be largely top-down initiatives. Yep. But they also seem to be like largely alienated from the art community. Like if you look through like Art in America or Art Forum or any of these other like major art journals, they're not writing about STEM to STEAM. Like,
No.
it's not on their radar. So you're kind of like, well, who is this serving? Who's it benefiting?
Yep.
And, it starts to feel a little bit like administrators leading the charge here on this sort of thing, which, we can all be skeptical and make funny comments about, but it definitely sort of feels this sort of this attempt to like demonstrate maybe to the parents of like potential humanities students that their dollars aren't going to be wasted if little Timmy goes off and like gets an art degree or something. Like, well, but he can work with engineers and learn to code. Like, well, okay.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
there's
what you're describing definitely is exactly how it's played out here at Virginia Tech, to my understanding. I mean, it's been administrator-led. There's a STEAM unit, but no one hates the STEAM unit as much as like the performing artists and visual artists who like just feel like it's awful. So, yeah, fascinating. Go ahead.
I don't know if it's awful. I guess I'm happy to see, like, in this day and age, like any support for any university initiative that doesn't involve hiring another associate dean, I'm all in favor of. But
right.
But I guess I just sort of I feel somewhat skeptical about it. And then as I write in the book, I had a number of conversations and sort of anecdotal evidence that I collected that, just kind of led me to believe that it really wasn't the artists who were imagined as being the primary community that would benefit from this. So,
definitely not. It's all about commercialization, as you write.
Yeah. And, that's another sort of facet that I write about in the book was, when you had this second wave of art and technology with the Media Lab and then the .com boom and all that, commercialization was a huge part of that. And, that's not necessarily like a bad thing, but if that's the only thing that is coming out of these partnerships, then you kind of have to like ask some questions. And I don't want to say like all art has to be like political, but I'm not really sure as I look at some of the stuff that comes out of these STEM to STEAM initiatives, like what any sort of larger social message is that is, again, but I don't want to like, pardon the pun, paint the whole thing with too broad of a brush, but this is based on what I'm observing.
Yeah, and to be clear, there are still great artists doing work at the interface of art and technology and doing stuff about technology. And you write about that in the book, like Trevor Paglin's in there, and so we're not we're not trying to caricature the whole picture. What are you working on now, man? What's next?
So I definitely have some, what I call orphan projects that are left over from the art and technology book. As I write about the very last pages of the book, as I was finishing it up, the Getty announced that it has, the Getty has these, what they call Pacific Standard Time program, and they're launching their third initiative. So their first one was basically just about art in Los Angeles after World War II. And these are very large programs that the Getty initiates and funds. So they did that. I want to say that was there in 2015-ish, somewhere in there, probably earlier than that. But then they did a follow-up to that, which was called LA/LA, and it was Los Angeles and Latin America. And it was looking at the dialogue between artists in Los Angeles and their counterparts in Latin American countries. And then for the third initiative, which is supposed to debut in 2024, all things remaining equal, they decided that the focus was going to be on art and science, which has come to mean art and science and engineering and everything else, but it's just art and science. So I'm involved with a couple of projects that are connected with institutions in Southern California that are funded by this Getty initiative. So that's, some smaller scale sorts of things. And then I'm hoping at some point to write another book. I have a contract to write a new book for MIT Press, which is about the history of computing as seen through sort of a eclectic collection of books about computing. So as I say, it's a book about books about computing, which sounds very meta. But the overall point of the book is basically how does a new technology become known? How does it become popularized? How does it become pervasive? How does it become sexy? And the argument that the book will make is one of the pathways, not the only pathway, but one of them is through books. And that we can use certain books as lenses or windows, if you will, into this 50 or 60 year, trajectory of the history of computing. So it's something I've been working on. It's, coming along slowly because obviously getting access to archives these days is challenging. And, I'm not in a particular hurry to do it. I'll do it when it happens. But, at this point, I'm trying to just remain healthy and hope that we don't devolve to a situation where we have to start eating squirrels.
Well, I'm already enjoying some of the things you're finding in the new project about like the rise of tech journalists and stuff. So I'm really looking forward to you drawing.
That's forward. Been fun. I mean, I could see that becoming like a standalone paper or something. But again, it's this whole question of, today we have these people who are tech reporters, and that's the thing that, their beat will be like one company, like they're the Facebook person at the New York Times. And it's like, well, you have to ask that question, like, well, where did this community, again, going back to what we started talking about originally, of journalists and writers, how did it sort of form and evolve and develop over time? In many ways, kind of, a spur or a thread, if you will, off of the people who were like traditional business reporters. And at some point, you sort of had a mutant strain evolve that basically wrote about technology and focused on, what was starting to be called Silicon Valley. So, that'll probably be one of the chapters of the book. But, there'll be others.
It's great, man. I'm looking forward to it. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on and talking to me today.
You're very welcome, Lee. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope your listeners got something useful from this.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.